Hello, and welcome to another episode of Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. And today, as we're all, the focus of the world is on the death of Queen Elizabeth II and the accession of Charles III to the English throne. I'd like to cover the space between Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II. Uh, Queen Victoria died in 1901. And you talk about the Victorian age, and it probably, I would argue, has more events, actually, more prof- profound events, even than in Queen Elizabeth's time. Although even Queen Elizabeth lived longer than Queen Victoria, but Queen Victoria did live through the Industrial Revolution and the forming of the British Empire. Anyway, the Prince of Wales, when she died, was Edward VII. She died in 1901. Edward VII came to the throne, and he had been Prince of Wales for too long. He was born in 1841 and didn't ascend the throne until 1901. And he was pretty much given to a life of pleasure. His mother looked upon him as a wayward child and even blamed him for the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, because Edward had gotten into trouble at Cambridge with an actress, and you know what actress meant in those days. So Albert went down to straighten things out with the authorities, and he caught a chill, and it didn't throw it off, and he died. Now, some people say actually it was the poor drainage system in Buckingham Palace that killed him, and not uh, the cold and the chill. But at any rate, she kind of blamed him for it, and she never showed him how to do what they call the red boxes. You might have seen about pictures of the red boxes now, talking about Queen Elizabeth now and her death. All the correspondence that was needed, and she basically didn't show him anything like that. Just didn't teach him how to govern. So he kind of governed hands off and devoted so much of his life to pleasure. However, he did see the rising power of Germany, and he realized that England would have to make a shift away from its long-term enmity with France, and in a sense, pro-German attitude, and get an agreement with France. And so there was a sort of semi-secret agreement called the Entente Cordiale, and that is what got England into one of the major things that got England into World War One. Well, Edward VII died in 1910, and his son George V took over. George V was entirely different. George V was straight arrow, family man, just exact opposite, almost exact opposite of Edward VII, who might have been called a playboy king, but George V was anything but that. But he was the domestic tyrant. He said, all of my kids were scared of my father or frightened of my father, and by God, my kids are going to be frightened of me. And it showed. I mean, his children kind of like Elizabeth II's children. That I don't think monarchs are very good at child raising. I think you can see why. The kind of a fishbowl that they live in. At any rate, George V uh, and his consort, Queen Mary, entered England into World War One. And there's they used to be called it wasn't the House of Windsor then, it was the House of Saxe-Coburg. Saxe-Coburg, and now they're at war with Germany. I mean, they had to change that, and somebody came up with a brilliant idea. Well, they live in Windsor Castle, so why say the House of Windsor? So there was letters patent and trumpets and formal. Hereby know all men by his presents that now they are known to be known as the House of Windsor, and Kaiser Bill got off the only funny line ever attributed to him. He said, "Well, I guess we're going to see the new play by Shakespeare, The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg." Well, anyway, George V became a beloved monarch during the war. He visited the troops, especially. He was there on the Western Front and so on. He lived through the General Strike of 1926, and then the Depression of the beginning of 1929, as you know. He died in 1936. And when he died, his eldest son was Edward, who would become Edward VIII, and he said that guy will ruin the empire. And he said there's more guts in Bertie, who will become George VI, and I'll get to that later, than in the rest of my kids. Well, as you know, Edward VIII ascended the throne, but he was never coronated because he was determined to marry a woman twice divorced and horrors, an American, twice divorced American. And people say usually, well, the establishment, they were very much fuddy-duddies and very high church and all that. Actually, the most unanimous opposition to to the accession the coronation of Edward VII came from the Dominion prime ministers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all the self-governing dominions that had prime ministers of their own. They said, no way, we're not going to do this. And so Edward realized that the time had come. And so he succeeded or abdicated in favor of his younger son, his younger brother, I mean, the Duke of York, the next in line to the next in line. Next in line is Duke of Windsor. I'm sorry, the Prince of Wales. The next in line beyond that is Duke of York. George, who became George VI. And George, all the accounts that he cried on his mother's arms or shoulder when he was told he was going to be king, because he was not a lot of George V's son. Remember I said, my kids will be frightened of me too. Like when he had stammers, and George, his father would say, spit it out, lad, spit it out, which is a good way to really stop people from stammering. And as you know from the movie, the King's speech, that he was able to overcome most of the stammer. And George VI, like George V, was also very much a straight arrow person. He married Elizabeth Bowles Lyon, an aristocrat, but they lived, as it were, happily ever after. However, George's consort always blamed Edward for basically killing her husband it had relatively short reign. So George VI did get coronated in 1937, and they by this time they'd had two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret Rose, and then they went into World War II, and George VI was a very conservative kind of guy, although he was really great with his kids and all. He was really pretty much straight arrow, fuddy-duddy, as it were, and still very shy. He hadn't completely overcome his stammer. If you listen to some of the speeches, like England going into the war and the speech when they won the war, you can see a slight hesitation is still there. But at any rate, when they got into the war, two members of Parliament, or one member of Parliament and the other member of the House of Lords, were. This is, how do you find a prime minister? You don't vote for him. I mean, the prime minister is elected by one constituency, and but then the party will say to the monarch, we want so and so to be our prime minister. Well, they forwarded two people, the prime minister, Earl of Halifax, and Winston Churchill. And a lot of I'm surprised they did nominate Churchill or present him to the king, because he had crossed the line. He'd been a conservative, then became a liberal, and then he went back again. He opposed Indian independence. He was in favor of Edward VII's remaining on the throne, considered something of a wild man or an aging young Turk. But he had got a lot of support for his opposition to Hitler, because the British opinion about Hitler at the time of the Sudeten crisis in 1938 was very much as Chamberlain said himself, it's a country, a quarrel in a far-off country between people of which we know little. Well, I mean, Czechoslovakia is about 600 air miles from England. It's not that far away country, and you pretty well better know what the argument was about, and that would be that there were these large numbers of Germans in one particular area of Czechoslovakia, is Sudetenland, or South Deutsch, South German. And Hitler said, well, now these are Germans, they must come back to Germany. So, as you know, Chamberlain crawled to Munich. And by the way, here's something no one else has brought up about the whole shameful Munich thing. Chamberlain and Daladier always went to Hitler. He never once came to them. I could imagine saying, well, Hitler, you come to, let's say, Belgium or something, a neutral country, and we can have, no, they had to go to first Bad Godesberg, Berchtesgaden, and then finally Munich for the final capitulation. But of course, Chamberlain didn't say that. And it was hysterical. I mean, the House of Commons went berserk when he brought back Peace for Our Time, and that scrap of paper he waved saying, we're determined we will not go to war again. And then Hitler also said publicly, "This is my last territorial demand in Europe." And then this would be October, the Munich Agreement was signed. In April, the German army moves into Czechoslovakia, which has very few Germans. They're all Czechs there. But so finally, the British said, we've got to, we can't trust this guy anymore. And I will give Chamberlain credit. He was a popular myth that Chamberlain didn't do anything for rearming. He did. I mean, the Spitfire was first built under Chamberlain and the Hurricane, these winners of the Battle of Britain. So at any rate, King George VI calls in Churchill, and then also Halifax. Now, Halifax was pretty much an appeaser. This, for the sake of peace, these people were hag-ridden by World War I. I mean, it's like every family, especially upper-class families, lost men into this war. I don't like that saying, rich men rich men start wars and poor men have to fight them. No, rich men give their sons over, okay? And there's hardly a aristocratic family or a wealthy family in England in World War I or World War II that did not give sons over to, in fact, World War I, 2 British prime ministers lost their sons in the war. Yeah, only rich men, they get away. At any rate, George VI was probably going to nominate or give the baton of prime minister to Lord Halifax, but Halifax didn't want to really tell the king, no, I don't want it. So he said, well, I'm in the House of Lords, so it really be hard for me to control Parliament, which was an argument not without merit. So Churchill was tapped, and later, not too much later on, Churchill and George VI had a very close relationship, and Churchill gave a very warm tribute to George VI when he died. Well, of course, this is all during the war, the wartime years, and the royal family lost people. What was his name now? Duke of Kent. The Duke of Kent, who'd be like third in line, was killed in a plane crash on active duty in Scotland, and so they gave their sons up to the war too. Buckingham Palace itself was bombed. Now, not terribly bombed, but it caused a fair amount of damage. And after that, the Queen Consort, Queen Elizabeth, said, now we can look the East End in the eye, because see, the East End's being bombed all to heck. And now we've been bombed too. And they made royal tours throughout the United Kingdom during the war, and that made them very popular. They were out there, commiserating with them, made them very popular. Well, the war ended in Europe in May of 1945, and great celebrations. In fact, the 2 royal princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret Rose, if you watch the biography of Queen Elizabeth, they went out there sort of incognito and were dancing and clapping and cheering with all the other blokes and Americans and Poles and Canadians. Everybody was in London during the war. It was a real international city. Just look at the shoulder tags, like every other one was a different country, Guyana, Nigeria, whatever. And they said that was one of the happiest times in their life. They had a couple of officers to keep an eye on them, but no real detectives or anybody. They just had a jolly good time. And so after the war, things were tough. It was the age of austerity. I was there in England after the war. Everything was still rationed. It's like, who won the bloody war anyway? Rationing, even bread was not rationed during the war, but this austerity government after the war, Labor government, I should mention this. Everybody thought, well, the war over, Churchill, great Churchill, he'll win again. Of course, he lost, because a lot of the English said, we remember what things were like before the war with you bloody conservatives, and we're not going to have it again. And so a Labor government came with a very strong majority. And the King George was going to give Churchill the Order of the Garter. And Churchill said, how can I accept the Garter from your Majesty when your Majesty's people had given me the Order of the Boot? So Churchill had these great one-liners. When Attlee, who was kind of a mousy guy, but very smart and everything, drove up to Buckingham Palace, and Churchill said, well, his car drove up and then nobody got out. So at any rate, to everybody's shock and surprise, that Churchill lost, that Conservatives lost by a big majority. And they really, really kept the screws down on them. England was broke. They were skinned. and they had to build up their foreign reserves, export, very big exports. When I was over there at the time, I never saw a modern English car. We Yanks had cars, yeah, but the blokes, all these wonderful Jags XK 120s and all, they all were imported to the States and some to Canada and whatever. So they really had to wonder who won the war, because the Germans actually were getting out of the war sooner, or the damage of the war, not the actual physical damage, but their economy and so on, because of excuse me, because of the Marshall Plan and so on. At any rate, George the Sixth was they'd been through a lot during, like a lot of people been through a lot during the war, all over the world. 40 million died, um, and he was deteriorating. He lived to open the Festival of Britain, which was 1951, and I was there and I went to it. I was very young then, of course. And that was kind of like the 100th anniversary of the Great Crystal Palace of 1851. And George the Sixth's speech when he opened it was like, so much of our treasure has been shot away in our wars and so on, but we will persevere. All the moderns of the modern world, because this was kind of like British technology on scale, jet airplanes, television. In fact, I saw one of the first 3D movies there. That was in black and white. That was just kind of people throwing spears and balls, supposedly out over the audience. But back in '51, and of course you had to wear glasses. I saw my first 3D. And of course, they were saying everybody's going to have TV, and and it never really. I guess the glasses, it never really caught on that much. But anyway, I went to Festival of Britain, and then that was opened in he opened it in, I think, May of 1951. And you could see from that he had really aged. And people are saying, well, that's the war would wear anybody out. But really, what it was is the House of Windsor, very heavy smokers. You look at those pictures of George, more than half of them, he's smoking, and they all did. I mean, all the brothers and the sisters, even Queen Mary smoked. And he had lung cancer, and they never really said the word, the C word. It was like, problems in circulatory problems, that sort of thing. And then somewhat unexpectedly, but not totally, on February 6, 1952, he died. And I was there when he died. And the whole country shut down for his funeral. All the BBC played was funeral music. I guess you'll hear it again for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. And somebody said, a commentator or whatever said at the time, George VI has lived through the most terrible times in English history. World War II, austerity, part of the Depression, because he came in 36. The Depression went on. It was coronated in 37. The Depression went on until the war. And I think there's some truth to that. But it seemed as though with this new, young, beautiful Princess Elizabeth, that England would say a new Elizabethan age. And in a way, it did happen. And I would say that for all of Western Europe, United States. Churchill said, if we win this war, we'll have new uplands of peace and happiness. And I'm sure people, oh, yeah, right, sure. Look at all the problems they have. But, all the problems they have, the English, Western Europeans, and then later on the Eastern Europeans lived far better than they did before the war. So, the war wasn't totally in vain. But anyway, what sort of, to give you an overview of the monarchs between Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth, and what they, of course, the many changes that had happened. But I still think maybe the greatest amount of change was in Queen Victoria's reign, although certainly Queen Elizabeth saw a lot. The big thing, of course, the end of the empire. In fact, when Queen Elizabeth was still Princess Elizabeth, she made that famous vow, very eloquent vow, she'd devote her life to her people and the empire. So all that ended. Well, that's another episode of Stan the History Man. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.